Thank you so much for this invitation. It's a hard act to follow such an amazing panel. But speaking with two hats on, one is as a member of IDS Food, that Olivier has introduced, and the other is as a director and researcher at the Institute of Development Studies, where we work for sustainable and equitable societies, including food equity. I want to bring one more element into this panel to make the case for why another reason for food system transformation, and a truly existential one, lies in preventing and preparing for pandemics. We've heard a lot in this panel about what one might call silent pandemics, the inexorable effects on human and indeed animal and plant health of our current food systems. But I want to talk about, as it were, what we might think of as real pandemics, the pandemics that have been capturing politics and the public imagination over the last few years, and which, as the world prepares for this World Health Assembly at the end of this month and for a new pandemics treaty in 2024, is at the uppermost of everybody's minds, pandemic diseases and their effects. And my argument is going to be that while a lot of the focus on preparing for pandemics is on drugs and on vaccines, pandemic preparedness is much, much more than this. Our recent IDS report, which talks about pandemic preparedness for the real world, identifies the potential to bring in an analysis of food systems, the ways that they contribute to disease outbreaks, which can then spread to become pandemics, to devastating and inequitable impacts. And if we're to head off future pandemic threats and protect the societal health and well-being of populations when they do occur, then food system transformation is vital through approaches that place care and equity and justice at their heart. So, to start, I think we need to recognize that almost all recent infectious disease outbreaks and pandemics are zoonoses. They originate in animals, and the processes through which they spill over to affect humans, in that word, are complex, they're context-specific, a lot isn't known, and there are a lot of misframings, I would argue, in the debates. But there is growing evidence of the roles of our current food systems along several pathways, and it's worth spelling those out. So one is via direct transmission, perhaps from wildlife, as proposed, for instance, for Ebola from bats and Nipah from bats, or Lassa fever from rodents, and widely feared given the myriad potential pathogens hosted in non-human natures. This implicates biodiversity, connecting disease risk with this kind of land use change that undermines biodiversity and the large-scale industrial agriculture and plantations that destroy it, that lead to the kind of forest fragmentation that has been now correlated with outbreaks of Ebola across Africa. But these are contested on the ground. We must beware simple one-way narratives. Villagers like those in the regions of Guinea where I've worked have a very different experience of cohabitation with bats and multi-way viral spillover between them, which now seems to have offered some protection to their populations against COVID, as well as underlying a rather different human-to-human narrative about how Ebola began. So complex and contested narratives, and we must look to the local. A second zoonosis pathway is directly from livestock, whether we're talking about African swine fever, H1N1, so-called swine flu, avian flu. They've all been linked to intensive industrial animal production, where confinement of high numbers with narrow genetic diversity in small spaces leave animals far more susceptible to viral infections and supports the conditions for those viruses to evolve into more infectious types. There are many animal welfare reasons for objecting to factory farming, but there is also a zoonotic disease spillover reason. And then global animal transport and trade can amplify those risks of spread, again, as we saw in 2009 with H1N1. In a third pathway, we see wildlife, domestic and farmed animals, and humans all interacting in intense interfaces where spillover can implicate all three. And a key site where that can often happen are food markets, as was the case for the big SARS pandemic in 2003, which originated in a bat virus that then transmitted to a civet cat in a food market, and then to humans. A scenario repeated for COVID-19, of course, in the Wuhan wet markets via a still uncertain intermediate host. One can focus in then on systems, and let's take poultry as an example, which I think exemplifies the growing human as well as animal health risks from highly intensified and industrialized production systems. Chicken numbers and density across the world are growing. Staggering figure that 70% of all bird biomass is now chickens, which I find quite extraordinary. And commercial units and factory farming and mass feeding operations are growing at the expense of the smaller backyard systems where people and chickens have lived and communicated together for maybe generations, to meet the growing global structural demand for cheap protein. And yet this is a source of the ongoing avian flu pandemic, now affecting more than 35 countries, more than 800 human cases from birds, but more significantly, the spectre of further viral mutation, which could lead to a human-to-human new flu pandemic of potentially existential proportions. But then poultry identifies some other, more silent pandemics, those to do with bacterial food poisoning and those to do with antimicrobial resistance. So AMR is described by WHO and others as the overlooked pandemic. It contributes, of course, to treatment failures and therefore increased human vulnerability to a wide range of bacterial infections and to their spread and their impact. Some of the latest figures suggest that AMR will cause over 10 million deaths per year by 2050. That's more than from cancer and diabetes, non-communicable diseases combined. We've got alarming levels of AMR reported actually in all countries, at all income levels, but they disproportionately affect poor individuals, partly because they have so much less access to the second line and more expensive antibiotic treatments when the first ones fail. And key causes, of course, of AMR are the misuse and overuse of antibiotics to promote growth and routinely prevent diseases, especially in intensified livestock farms. It isn't, of course, just the immediate interfaces between humans and animals and their viruses and their pathogens that matter, but the wider social, ecological, and political economic drivers that shape them, and which are part and parcel of our global food systems. They range from population displacements and climate change, land investments and grabs, long market chains, the trade, economic and financial models underpinning them, about which we've heard a lot in these panels. Global food supply chains, especially when they don't have enough regulation of cross-border food safety and quality, or large-scale corporate investments in commodities such as palm oil, are deeply embedded parts of our global food economies, but they're also ones that promote disease risk at scale. They're structural, as we've heard, they involve power. But thinking beyond how outbreaks occur, let's think for a minute also about how food systems help to drive the spread of outbreaks to become pandemics and then to create these devastating and inequitable impacts. Global maps tell only a small part of the story, and again, it's a food system story. Who gets sick and why depends on social differences, inequities, and their structural drivers. As we saw with COVID, where it was past health and dietary inequalities that shaped those really big differences across race, across class, across place, that created such huge disparities in effects of severe disease and death. In some cases, we saw food system conditions amplifying spread, whether amongst crowded workers in factories and meat plants, or as hungry people, resource-poor people, necessarily flouted stay-at-home orders. And COVID also revealed how disease control efforts, sometimes more than disease itself, amplified hunger and food insecurity by clamping down on informal work, on food seeking, such that the World Food Programme has estimated that 150 extra people went hungry, 150 million during the pandemic. And Oxfam rightly termed COVID-19 the hunger pandemic. And while some governments stepped up, were able to step up with enhanced social protection, safety nets, and food distribution measures, in many cases they didn't or they couldn't, and voluntary efforts from food banks to neighbourhood distribution measures had to fill gaps. And we can applaud the human care and compassion underlying those, but the fact that they were needed, I think, exposes the real vulnerability of our food systems and their extreme failures in the face of shocks. So, One Health, as we've heard, offers an approach to addressing, I think, many problems with food systems, and those include pandemics. And I think it's timely that a recent set of articles in The Guardian, in The Lancet, and a new panel and theory of change has underlined the value of One Health now for global health security. I think there are opportunities now to interconnect One Health thinking and action far more firmly with food systems transformation. But again, equity is key. It's too easy to keep One Health and the commitments of the quadripartite global agencies at the level of global commitments without looking at the realities of these interactions on the ground. And it's easy, too, to promote solutions which are going to change those interfaces, reduce pandemic risk, apparently, but actually damage people's livelihoods and food security in the process. So when a wet market is closed, as a zoonotic disease risk, what happens to the small-scale traders and consumers dependent on it? When separating people from allegedly viral bats in a forest becomes a new justification for fortress forest conservation, what about those whose lives are interdependent with those forests? Blanket bans on antimicrobials and livestock systems might seem an obvious way to curtail AMR. But what about the small-scale producers too, who will lose their animals and their livelihoods to disease? So I think just as health equity needs ecological equity, it needs food equity too. So One Health for the real world, like pandemic preparedness for the real world, needs approaches that are integrating equity of all these different kinds. There are ways forward within existing food systems. I take one example here from the One Health Poultry Hub, which has been promoting reduced use of antimicrobials and in the Bangladesh poultry production system, cutting back on factory farming techniques, and improving farmers' access to veterinary services, to credit, and to information, which stops them having to do things like this, selling sick chickens and making use of really unhygienic markets. But I think we need to go beyond these too, towards more imaginative changes across our food systems, where we can look for positive synergies unfolding that enhance pandemic prevention, ensure resilience, minimize impacts. And those might be solutions that look to alternative proteins, to local agri-food approaches that work with, not against, non-human natures, and to their scaling up into wider principles and movements, as we've seen with agroecology or with food sovereignty and more. Examples, as we've heard, are blossoming across the world. They're often led from the local, from the knowledge and perspectives of the small-scale farmers, local communities, citizens, indigenous peoples. They need recognition and they need support. So pandemic threats and crises, I think, could and should be an opportunity to speed up the transformations in food systems that we need for so many reasons, towards ones that, yes, help hold off pandemics and are resilient when they happen, but also do so much more. This will not be easy because, as we've heard, the features of food systems that work against these things are deeply enwrapped with politics and power. Challenging those will be essential. It needs transformation in knowledge to be more interdisciplinary, more diverse, and in underpinning values too, towards a view ultimately which is not quite so human exceptionalist, which is less mechanistic, and in which we are as concerned about the welfare of non-human natures in ecologies and in animal life as humans, towards approaches that place care, equity, and indeed compassion amongst all beings at its heart. Thank you so much.